Japan chair here and a professor at Georgetown. Before we begin, a few safety announcements. I am your designated safety officer. If there's an emergency, I will give the I will give the deployment order, and we will go outside. And the rally spot is National Geographic on M Street. I'd also ask you to please leave your earphones and translation devices in the seat when you leave. Otherwise, we will be able to find you wherever you go. We have this opportunity every year thanks to Nikkei Shimbun and the Japan Center for Economic Research, and my old friend Sunohara-san, who has, with his team, put together one of the most important forums now on international security, the Mount Fuji Dialogue, which convenes usually in the fall and brings together leading practitioners, politicians, intellectuals on international affairs. And really, it has become one of the standout international conferences alongside conferences like Shangri-La in Singapore, Halifax, which is on transatlantic security. It really has become one of the pillars of public and private discourse on security. In this case, especially focused on the U.S. Japan alliance. And in addition to this forum every year, the Mount Fuji Dialogue and JCER and Nikkei team brings leading defense experts to Washington, to Texas, to Hoover Institution in California, to continue the dialogue throughout the year. And this is one of those opportunities. We're going to hear from really the best and brightest of Japanese defense policy thinking in U.S. Japan alliance. I'll ask first Aki Nagashima to open up. Aki, many of you know, the most important job he ever had in his entire career was working with me at the Council on Foreign Relations 20 years ago, and then after that it was downhill. He managed to get a job in the House of Representatives. He managed to somehow become National Security Advisor and State Minister of Defense, but basically it was all downhill after he worked in Washington. But we're very delighted. Then we'll hear from Gen Nakatani, very distinguished leader in Japan, former defense minister, member of the House of Representatives from Kochi Prefecture. He served as defense minister from 2014 to 2016. He's a graduate of the National Defense Academy and officer in the Ground Self-Defense Forces. I suspect that for many years when he was a lieutenant and a captain, and U.S. generals saw his name, G-E-N, Gen, they saluted. But it's pronounced Gen. And it's a Japanese name, it's not his rank. And actually, he outranks all those generals now anyway. And we'll hear from him. And then from another leading intellectual and policymaker, Satoshi Morimoto, known to many of you, currently special advisor to the Minister of Defense, chancellor at Takushoku University. He was Minister of Defense in 2012. Had a distinguished career in JASDAF and the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. He's a graduate of the Defense Academy. 30 years ago, when Sheila and I were at Tokyo University, and I was working for Shiina Moto, a defense intellectual in the Liberal Democratic Party. Exciting jobs was to be kabanmochi, was to carry papers from the Diet to Morimoto Sensei in the Foreign Ministry. It was very exciting. And he gave me very encouraging words for my career, like, arigato. He actually gave me a lot of advice, and that's during the Cold War. That's some time ago. And he's been a strong bipartisan advocate of the alliance in Japan's defense policy. And then Sheila Smith, who studied with me at Todai when she was in second grade.
Thank you.
And one of the leading intellectuals here in the United States. She's a senior fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations and author of some of the best books on Japanese security policy, Intimate Rivals on Japan-China relations, and Japan's New Politics and U.S.-Japan Alliance, which is on our topic today. She also helps us at Georgetown teaching courses on Japanese politics. So I'll ask each to give some opening remarks. We'll have a few discussions and then open it up to the audience, because looking out, I see actually quite a few veterans and experienced and rising stars in security policy as well. So,
okay.
Aki, thank you.
Good morning. Thank you, Mike, for a kind and accurate introduction. I feel privileged to have yet another opportunity to speak here at CSIS. As you know, since the Party of Hope, that I am one of the founders, was resolved last week, hopelessly. And I became a homeless. So as a lone wolf in the Japanese diet, I am now more than ready to speak frankly and enjoy freedom of speech. The world today is looking more and more like a great power game among the United States, Russia, and China, as the Trump administration described in its national security strategy last December. It is taking place in a multi-dimensional theater, from maritime, space, to the cyber. Furthermore, it seems that there are no rules, and actually order is, being disrupted without any concern for the consequences. Therefore, in this era where the great power competition has returned, cooperation among like-minded nations who share the same value remains just as important. More than ever, this cooperation among the nations who seek to maintain the status quo and avoid a conflict has become crucial. From this perspective, I think it is evident to all that the Japan-US alliance plays an even more important role as the cornerstone of the security and development to the free, open Indo-Pacific region. At the same time, a new cooperation with like-minded strategic partners will be essential. This is the Quad cooperation among Japan, the United States, Australia, and India. First of all, regarding the Korean Peninsula, my conclusion is we must maintain robust deterrence against the DPRK, period. Yes, we watched the historical North-South Summit meeting last week. While the joint declaration refers to denuclearization, there have still not been any evidence that this time is different. Moreover, we all cannot deny the possibility that they are just buying time, as they did before. If they are still trying to buy time, we should make full use of that time to strengthen Japan-US joint countermeasures that can neutralize their ambitions. Likewise, we should deepen both bilateral and or multilateral cooperation in the East and South China Seas to deter escalation from a gray zone to a conflict. Since I made my case on these issues last year here, let me just emphasize one key element. The key to credible deterrence is the readiness towards an escalation scenario. So the regional states' capacity building in law enforcement will be critical. Japan and the United States must take a concerted response in South China Sea and provide support to the Philippines and Vietnam as well as countries. We should maintain a maritime presence led by the United States, but with Japanese and Australian participation. I think it would be worthwhile to draw a model from the Standing Naval Force, a multinational effort conducted in Europe in the 70s and 80s. Currently, the front line of the great power competition is in South China Sea. If we fail to support the Philippines and Vietnam, the will come all the way to Guam. That is exactly why we need to firmly commit to the security of the South China Sea. The core of the Japan-US alliance is the cooperation between self-defense forces and U.S. military. Meanwhile, I think the Quad will be more comprehensive cooperation. The Quad countries are all major powers along the outer edge of the Indo-Pacific region. Thus, this cooperation will contribute to creating monolithic platform for the development and the stability of the region as a whole. In this era of the great power competition, the Quad can be more than a cooperation. India, being a member of the Quad, has special significance. India is a rising power that is part of the BRICS along with China and Russia. If such a rising power can truly establish a cooperative relationship with its status quo partners without any friction, it means that they can prove to the international community that rising powers would not necessarily challenge the status quo, but can actually play a responsible role. This, I believe, is the invariable characteristics of the Quad. Above all, we must promote economic cooperation. It is not about promoting trade, investment, and technological cooperation, but it's essential to reinforce regional connectivity and build high-quality infrastructure as an alternative to One Belt, One Road initiative, to reduce the cost for flow of goods, people, and information if a region is to prosper in the era of globalization. Secondly, we must strengthen security cooperation. I'm happy to say that Trilateral security cooperation between Japan, the United States, and India is progressing and steadily catching up to that of Japan, the United States. We must pursue cooperation in a seamless manner among the Quad for maritime security in the Indo-Pacific. Third, we also need political cooperation. For example, there should be regular summit meetings of the four nations to better align in policy and capability. In conclusion, I must insist that this competition is not about defeating the opponent, but it should be about urging them to be responsible powers. Before I end, I just want to add one more thing for my American friends. I strongly believe that the American comparative advantage is in the very fact that the United States takes leadership to promote cooperation among the like-minded countries. Of course, it is of urgency that the United States rebuilds the American hard power, given this return of the great power competition and the fact that the American influence is changing in nature. But I also believe that this hard power should not be pursued at the expense of the needed soft power. U.S. leadership in promoting international cooperation. What I mean is we cannot sacrifice free trade, rule of law, and democracy because these are the very values U.S. leadership is based on. I have no intention of criticizing America first. In any nation, the head of the state should seek to maximize their national interest, but it should not be at other nations' expense. That will be no different from the so-called sharp power of China. And it literally will mean that the United States has abandoned its most strong and effective comparative advantage before even engaging in a competition among the great powers. I'd like to conclude by wishing that through the Quad and our alliance, in which we Japanese are ready to take a larger and broader responsibility, our two great nations could open a new chapter of stability and prosperity to this region. Thank you.
Thank you.
Good morning, gentleman Nakatani です。
Good morning. My name is Gentleman Nakatani. It's not general. I visited Korea and I met with Prime Minister Lee Nak-hyun and then Song Yong, Defense Minister, and then also the National Diet members, and also I had a meeting with the National Unification Advisory Council. And so, to be honest, the Korean government mentioned that there is no solution without the improvement, the relationship between the United States and North Korea. And for North Korea to achieve full denuclearization, meaning that the United States should have a good cooperative relations with the international community. And this negotiation between the South and North is coming from creative ideas. And as long as North Korea is stuck on this idea of having nuclear, then it is difficult for them to develop economically. And of course, North Korea understands the political risks. However, they are choosing to go forward with the economical development and also denuclearization declaration. And for now, politically speaking, Korea is hoping that the promise with North Korea will be true, and then also going along with other leaders of other countries. And for the Korean Peninsula to end this armistice and then going into the peace treaty, and of course that Korea would like to contain this situation to have a permanent result. And in the future, there is going to be a North Korea and the U.S. summit. And at the same time, there's going to be a trilateral summit between U.S., Japan, and China. I think this is going to be a very big diplomatic opportunity to discuss East Asia security and then also economic cooperations. And also, we can have a surprise to gain an opportunity to talk with China and then also Korea as the Abe administration hopes to do so. And for now, the horizontal axis has been Japan, U.S., and Korea to have this security cooperations. And then also the horizontal axis has been economy based on the relationships between Japan, China, and also Korea. And based on these axes, we have been working to contain the situation in the Korean Peninsula. And I think that this is going to be a good chance for us to reestablish the six-party talk for security and also economic matters. And for 2004, there was a concept paper published for six-party talk. And in 2005, there was another goal was set for verifiable denuclearization in the Korean Peninsula, and then also NPT and IAEA's early recovery was discussed. And in 2008, and North Korea was discussed to be eliminated from the terrorist supporting state, and so that's what the United States was thinking about back in 2008. Of course, we have to discuss the abduction issue as the nation of Japan. And so for that to be resolved, we do have to have negotiations between Japan and North Korea. And of course that Japan has requested the United States to raise this issue as well. And based on the Pyongyang declaration, we can still utilize the six-party talk so that we can mobilize the power from China and also Russia as well. And of course, we have to look at the relationship between Japan and Korea. I spoke with senior officials from the Korean government. We talked about some emotional or sentimental issues in the public opinions. In the MOFA's website, there is a poll regarding Japanese nationals' sentiments regarding Korea, and then So based on a poll, the Japanese people who feel affinity to Korea is about 31.5%, and then less Japanese people who have less friendliness to Korea is 66.4%. And then in terms of the Korean polls, Korean nationals have negative impressions about Japan, which accumulates to 72.5%. So these numbers are actually posted on the MOFA's website, and I think that there are a lot of room for us to improve the relationship between Japan and the United States, Korea, excuse me. And then I'd like to talk about the denuclearization.
Currently, there are many nuclear arms that North Korea has. We don't have exact numbers. In the Japanese Diet, the Ministry of Finance, its documents is being discussed, and there's not much discussion. In fact, there's no discussion about what's happening in North Korea with its nuclear arms. So we need to apply pressure in South Korea. To what degree does North Korea have missiles? It has not announced that either. And so North Korea, its own declaration of how many missiles it has, we need to verify even that. So up until now, the discussion of denuclearization is something that has not been, the word hasn't been used, and verification hasn't been undertaken. So plutonium and uranium are two things that are necessary for nuclear arms. But as far as plutonium is concerned, where is the plutonium in North Korea? To what degree is it used in weapons? This is not clear. Further, it's said that there are several thousand underground military facilities that cannot be seen by the United States and other countries. So we need cooperation. There's often discussion about what happened in Libya and in Iraq, but those are two desert countries. It was easy to verify them. Also, it was, even though it was not known whether they had nuclear weapons or not, it was unclear. But in North Korea, they've already declared that they have weapons. So this makes it easier to know exactly whether they have them or not. And also, it makes it more necessary to undertake verification. And so that's something that we need to work on. And finally, as far as U.S. troops in South Korea, these troops are very important to maintain balance in Northeast Asia and for Japan's security. So what sort of negotiations will happen over this? Currently, we would like to see the United States maintain its current forces in South Korea. Also, if there is a peace agreement between North Korea and other countries, then the UN command will no longer have any rationale for staying there. And also, there will be a shift of strategic decision-making from the United States to South Korea. These are two things that need to be followed up on. And that concludes my remarks.
Hi.
My name is Morimoto. 5 years ago, I served as the Minister of Defense, and Mr. Gemba was also Minister of Defense. And when I was the Minister of Defense, my deputy minister was Mr. Nagashima, who is next to me, and I refer to him as my subordinate in the Diet. When I was a minister, and then served as the special advisor for Minister for Defense. I worked with some of my colleagues, and currently Mr. Onodera is the Minister of Defense. He's someone I very much trust. He's a very trustworthy Minister of Defense. And once I've been in and out of the Ministry of Defense 5 times now. So really, the only post I haven't had at the Ministry of Defense is work as a security guard. And as far as military policy, forces to be sent deployed in domestically and outside of the country. We have numerous documents that are written about what is happening, and the documents have been uncovered, and there's been a lot of discussion in the Diet about whether they include the word combat or not. We've had there are many small accidents that we have in our country with our forces and the United States forces, and it takes us a lot of time to discuss these, and it's also difficult for us because we don't have enough time to really explain to our people what exactly happened. So I spent a long time in that position not having enough time. And as far as what we should do about our defense forces, the issues we have, let me talk about the main points. Japan's current defense budget is about 5,200 billion yen in dollars. How much would that be? About 50 billion, I think? $50 billion. But Japan's military expenditures include money for salaries, for uniforms, for food. These come to about 43% of our overall budget. So the amount of our budget that's allocated to armaments is very small. Using these defense expenditures, we have worked in developing ISR capability and also in enhancing the abilities of our forces. We've purchased a number of different armaments, the F-35A, the Aegis Ashore, the Standoff Missile, E-2D, Global Hawk, and V-22 Osprey planes, Standard Missile Block 2A. All of these armaments we have purchased from the United States under the aegis of foreign military sales. Our foreign military sales purchases are quite large in the overall number. And that means that we buy a lot of advanced armaments. But how is it that we can balance our military budget? This is something that we are currently grappling with. And as far as this year is concerned, we will begin our new Defense Forces build-up program. And for that reason, we have to build up and come to a new National Defense Program guideline. And so we are working on that now. Finally, in my imagination, about December, I think, maybe in the middle of December, in other words, next year's budget should be able to be fixed at the end of December, given that the guidelines and other things will be in place. As far as the demand for or the guideline for the budget, I think that this will be submitted around the time when the documentation is complete. And my LDP colleague has discussed this in the budget, and we have gotten his opinion, and I think that this will be disclosed later, or perhaps in this month. As far as what happens in the National Defense Program guidelines, this lays out what we're thinking, and summarizing it in one word perhaps, or one phrase, I should say that After the initiation of the National Defense Forces after World War II, we have never been involved in war, but it's possible that we may not be able to continue that situation. We may have to become involved in conflict. This is something we always need to keep in mind. And so what is it we can do now to allow our forces to be able to fight? This is one of the largest points addressed in the new guidelines. We need to create defense forces that can actually fight. And in order to do that, we need to work on capacity building to allow our forces to do that. So for that, we need to have missile defense. We need to have maritime and land forces that can fight. We also need to be able to provide defense for our outlying islands and also to defend our maritime waters. And so we'll work on capacity building in these areas. And so that our troops can fight and continue to fight, we need to work at resupply on land and resupply on the sea. Another central issue is something that's like the situation in Canada. We have ground forces, air forces, and maritime forces. But how is it that we can undertake a dynamic joint defensive force construction? We cannot just work on having the three forces dynamic joint defense force. We need to look at actual combat, also space and cyberspace. We need to dramatically increase our abilities in those areas. So we are facing a need for increase in our ability to defend cyberspace, our ability to observe from space, our ability to deal with illegal activities. We need to increase these capabilities. We also need to have better dynamic joint defense forces. So these are things that we are working on, and how is it that we will accomplish these tasks? This is what we're working on now. And finally, let me discuss a couple of issues. The one that gains the most attention is the F-35A that we have purchased from the United States. We have agreed to buy 42. But how is it that we could increase that number? Also, F-35B. This is used by the U.S. Navy. It can take off and land vertically. We have looked at what we should do as far as purchasing this. Further, in the 2030s, the current F-2 combat plane will be retired. This was developed on the platform of the F-16, but we need to look at what we will use as a successor to that combat plane. And so this is a large issue also that we're grappling with. Also, the United States and Britain we're waiting for their offer on solidification. And so we view this as a large issue, not only for us, but also for the U.S. Japan alliance. Further, let me talk about two other points. The first is, as far as peacekeeping operations, that we have been involved in this for over 20 years in many different areas, including South Sudan. We've completed our mission in South Sudan, and there aren't really any good areas now for us to become involved in other PKO forces. So our contribution to a peacekeeping order is low among all of the developed countries. As far as our contributions to the United Nations, we are about 2 or 3 among all the UN members as far as the amount of money we pay. It's fine to pay our dues, but we need to look at what it is we can do to contribute to the world order outside of peacekeeping operations. I think that it's a little bit late to look at where it is we can become involved in other peacekeeping operations. It seems rather that we should be concerned about the rise of new dictatorships. Furthermore, the developing countries, their incomes are increasing a little bit, but the gap between the developed countries and the developing countries is widening. And also, there are many refugees that need to be dealt with. So basically, we can look at this as a global disparity. So we should look at what we can do about peace building, a new peace building, and what is it that we as Japan can provide to that? How can we provide money? How can we provide military forces in order to work on closing this gap? So we hope that we can cooperate with the United States in that regard. One other thing. The international order based on the rule of law. This is something that is often ignored. The United States, Mr. Mattis and our defense minister met, and we were very glad that we were able to come to an agreement on shipments to North Korea, illegal shipments of contraband. And so currently we are working with the UK, Australia, and Canada in the bases that are in our country to work as a multilateral team. And this is something that we can do, an example of what we can do on a multilateral level in order for us to maintain the international order. So we have become much more involved in various activities, and we're not just adhering to the U.S. Japan alliance guidelines, in other words, providing logistics support. We are also working on an operational level, and I think that we need to increase that. Finally, in order to undergird all of this, we need to look at development of dual-use technology for armaments, and to use these dual-use technologies in order to jointly develop armaments and produce them with our allies, and to enhance interoperability of these armament systems. This is part of the third offset, and that is the area in which it is anticipated under the third offset that Japan would be able to make a large contribution. So, what is it that we are really working on? What's the highest priority? You probably can't tell from what I'm saying, but I think that if I had to distill it to one point, I would say it is that working on true cooperation under the U.S. Japan alliance, we need to look at what sort of defense posture we should build in terms of the soft side and the hard side. This really is the largest issue with which you're grappling.
Be here. I want to thank the organizers of the Mount Fuji Dialogue for including me today. And it's an honor and a privilege to be here with the Japanese political leaders who have guided Japanese strategic planning for the last so many years. I have three basic points to raise for hopefully to kick off the discussion. The first is about what Nagashima-san, sorry, I called you Aki there. Nagashima-san raised at the beginning, which is the strategic environment in which Japan finds itself. And one of the largest challenges for Japan, and obviously for those who make policy for the future, is Japan's strategic capacity. This is an era in Asia that will be difficult for Japan, even if all of the policy variables are lined up correctly, right? So the Chukibo Taiko process that Professor Morimoto laid out for us here, it does have to look ahead at a moment when change is accelerating in Northeast Asia. It is not the old deliberative, slow process in which Japan is going to have to make its decisions. And a large part of the strategic arsenal is now going to have to be Japanese military power. However, Japan that power. I wonder if at some point we could talk a little bit about the resources that Japan can bring to bear on not only the next 5 years, but let's just look out 5 to 10 years from now. How do you envision Japan's capacity to cope with, obviously, a rising China, perhaps peace, or perhaps the Korean Peninsula, we don't know. But the missions, I think, that all three of you have discussed do require a significant amount of investment in Japanese military capability. And I know Mr. Watanabe is here from ATLA. There's another aspect to this, which is a technological aspect. But I wonder if you could, the three of you could comment on this. The second point I wanted to raise, and this is true of all democracies, but these decisions are made in a political context. I think Morimoto-san raised the question of the SDF logs. I don't want to have a big debate about civilian control here. I don't think that's actually the issue. What's interesting to me is the Self-Defense Force now has operated abroad for 2.5 decades. It has operated in dangerous peacekeeping situations. It has operated in Iraq and in other places where the Japanese military has been placed in considerable danger. And I think, as Morimoto-san said, if you order your military into a situation, you should allow it to do its job. So for me, the fact that there is records of these missions is less of a question of civilian control and more of a question of good policymaking. There should be some way to incorporate the learning of the self-defense forces in these missions into making better policy. And I just wanted to ask especially our politicians, I don't want to introduce difficult topics, but what I'd like to understand better is what you think the learning has been over the last 2 decades of a very important expansion in SDF responsibilities abroad. And then finally, obviously, the alliance. We are in a moment of fairly accelerated change. We have a president who likes accelerated change and unpredictability. For somebody like me who sits in Washington, I hold my breath a little bit because I'm not quite sure that our allies can cope with that unpredictability in a way that makes both Japan and South Korea feel at ease. But I'm wondering what you think we can do here in the United States to facilitate this next phase of Japan, South Korea, U.S. dialogue on the future of the Korean Peninsula. Negotiations in the past have often been points of tension in the Japan-Korea relationship, in the U.S.-Japan relationship, in the U.S.-ROK relationship, and it's going to be fundamentally crucial that we are on the same page if we want to seriously engage Kim Jong-un in negotiation. And so I would like to hear your thoughts about what you think is important for us here in Washington to try to remind our government about as we try to move forward. But the flip side of that is we also need to keep our defenses and our deterrence strong in the meantime. And what was striking for me in looking at last year, 2017, when the North Koreans were shooting missiles in the direction of Japan with alarming frequency, was the extent to which our militaries, the U.S. ROK alliance, the U.S. Japan alliance, gained a certain degree of synchronized demonstration of our capabilities. Granted, we still don't have Japanese forces visiting the Korean Peninsula, and we don't have South Korean forces visiting Japan. But we made a lot of headway in demonstrating the two alliances' capability should there be a conflict in the region. So this balancing act to me is both how do we keep the negotiations on track so that we don't get out of step, but how do we also build on that experience of last year to make sure that the alliances continue to be effective at both defense and deterrence?
We're not going to clap because you're asking questions.
I'm asking
and they're
questions.
really hard questions.
I'm sorry.
But thank you. So let me turn to our visitors. Maybe start with the last one, Nakatani, Gentleman Nakatani. How do we maintain U.S., Japan, Korea trilateral coordination, especially if we're talking about a peace treaty, which may lead some in South Korea and will definitely lead China and Russia to say, you don't need U.S., Japan, Korea military exercises. You don't need THAAD. So how do we keep our deterrence and our coordination, as Sheila says, if we're also negotiating a so-called peace treaty?
はい、基本的には3
Basically speaking, 3 years ago, there's a guideline signed between U.S. and Korea, and then also Japan has its own legislation for peace and security. This enables us to have seamless response, and then also for our defense capabilities. I think that our response has become fuller than ever, and then also we would like to expand our scope to work with not only bilaterally but multilateral cooperations are necessary. And then of course that collective self-defense right is should be held by Japan so that we can assure the existence or the survival of Japan. However, regarding PKO and also international cooperations, we do have legal limits for these matters. And then also we are still facing some difficulties in 5 areas. And also we are working to expand or adjust or amend our legislative systems so that we can discuss possibly a constitutional reform as well. And the Abe administration has proposed some kind of interpretations, and also some of the discussions are ongoing. And of course, Japan are still focusing on how we can contribute to better peace and also security in the international community. For diplomatic relationships, there are 3 keywords here, and then there are multiple domains and also dynamic joint defense capabilities. And then so those keywords are important for us to have capabilities not only ground, maritime, and air, but at the same time space and cyber as well. And then there's a word IAMD. This is a joint capability or joint strike capability to improve the defense status. And also there's another keyword is a red line policy. For example, if when China invaded the first island chain to ignore that A2D2, and then so that part we have to watch this new issues so that Japan can assure its defense. And of course, defense is a very costly matter. And also there are some uncertainties. And then we do have to have its own deterrence so that other countries do not launch missiles toward Japan or to Japan directly. And then so we have been making suggestions as a LDP party to the Abe administration, the government itself.
Answer the question also of, or begin to address the question of capacity and strategy to deal with a more complex, multi-domain range of threats. I want to ask Morimoto Sensei about that. But first, do you have any comment on the Japan-U.S.-Korea Trilateral? And second, about capacity, which Sheila raised, you mentioned the tension between capability in procurement and Koksan, maintaining defense technology industrial base. There's another tension, which is between, you might say, velocity and mass. In other words, a system like the F-35 or Aegis Ashore is extremely capable. But if the enemy fires hundreds of missiles, it's not the most cost-effective response. So picking up on Sheila's question about Japan's capacity to pay for this that Nagatacho-san described, how does Japan maintain enough mass, enough ammunition, enough munitions that are high-tech enough? You know, maybe we need thousands of bullets that have simple guidance rather than 10 missiles that can hit missiles. This is the other tension between the technological with velocity and then just the amount of things we have to shoot at incoming missiles. So if you want to comment on U.S., Japan, Korea, that'd be great. But this capacity question, how would you answer, Sheila, including this question of ammunition readiness, mass?
That is a very difficult question. Regarding the Korean Peninsula, if there's a contingency in Korean Peninsula, we would evaluate that as a situation that can influence Japan significantly. And for that, Japan can work together to enforce other countries' forces, namely Australia, so that Japan can provide logistical support to that force. And I think that logistical support from Japan may not be sufficient. In my personal opinion, I think Japan should be able to provide operational support. And then, of course, that refueling and supplying goods and also maintenance, those are considered rather a logistical support, but we may be able to support in patrol, search and rescue, and also NEO, that's non-combatant evacuation operations. And then so those three can be our operational capability that we may be able to offer to other countries' forces. And then this can somewhat improve the relationship with Korea as well. The current guidelines are very well made. However, in the true sense of contingency, we still need to make some revisions regarding how we can respond to some types of gray zone incidents or situations. And regarding the relationship between U.S., Japan, and Korea, ammunitions or armament capabilities are different, are important, so that they can this can be shared among three countries. Let's see the NATO forces. I think that they have enough interoperability that their armamental equipment can be used different countries. It's called AXA. There's an Korea is being hesitant about AXA with Japan. So to give a concrete example, Korea is very hesitant for welcome Japanese self-defense force equipment to come into the territory of Korea. So AXA can improve the situation that maybe we can have a wider opening for us to work together. And without this AXA, then Japan cannot operate NEO in the territory of Korea. And so I think this is becoming very critical. and then also for us to have a substantial supports to other countries, we need to have that kind of relations. And then also, I think that sharing depots or ammunitions are still not sufficient, and then so I think that extra or stored or the inventory of munitions should be staged in strategically, and then so that if we have constant access to ammunitions and also equipment in strategically important locations, I think it will be very important.
Standoff Missile
Also, the Standoff Missile, which we'll be introducing, this is something that is related to a discussion about whether we should be able to hit foreign bases, whether we can attack an enemy. Do we have the ability to target? Do we have the ability to hit the target? Do we have ability to make radar ineffective? Do we have an ability to make a very high-level attack? These are four things that we are working on, and we are looking at what we can do to divide the responsibilities between the United States and Japan. But as far as the Standard Missile is concerned, we are looking at how this would play out in a gray zone. In other words, a situation where it's not clear exactly what's happening. I think that we need to think more in terms of division of responsibility between the United States and Japan. Must we leave everything outside of Japan to the United States, and we only concentrate on the domestic front, or is there something more that Japan can do? This is something we're looking at, and I think that we need to continue to study this and see what we can do to cooperate more intimately with the United States on the planning level. And so this is something that we will need to address in order to enhance our military abilities. As far as attacking enemy bases, the LDP is working on what it is we can do to attack missiles that have been deployed. Our conclusion is that we should have that ability and that we should engage in research and development toward that end.
Points. The new capabilities we're talking about raise the question of whether we need a new understanding on roles, missions, and capabilities in the alliance. The importance of more jointness and interoperability in gray zone and many other challenges raises the question of whether we need to think about command and control differently. For example, a Japan Joint Operational Command JOC, the role of U.S. Forces Japan or Pacific Command. We don't have a joint and combined command right now. What we heard from Nakatani Sensei and Morimoto Sensei suggests we have a lot of homework to do.
Yes.
And could you comment on that? And especially on the politics. Is it going to be necessary in Japan to have a public debate, legislation about these questions of roles and missions, of command and control relationships, or is there enough of a basis in the current laws and policies to implement? How much of a hurdle are we facing in policy, regulations, law to do some of the things that we've heard about? Is this a big political homework assignment, do you think? Or is there enough consensus to move forward with what framework we have? I'm talking about Japan.
In the 2005 decision that we can become involved in collective security. I don't think that we need to do anything more in that regard, but the U.S. Japan alliance, probably the largest issue we're dealing with is integration. Up until now, we've been saying, well, we can't do this, we can't do that. And so while we've been talking about joint this and joint that, the fact is that we had separate command structures, and we did what we could to know more about each other. We really didn't do that much in that regard. We need to have truly combined command structure, and in order to get close to that, we need to look at planning, training, operations. We need to look at that cycle, and then that leads again to planning. That sort of cycle is something that we need to become involved in. And 20 years ago, we talked about the possibility of setting up a structure like NATO that would allow for integration of daily tasks, and that's something we maybe should consider again. Also, we didn't used to have an NSC, but now we do within the President's office, the Prime Minister's office, and also as far as Hawaii is concerned, there's the Pacific Command located there, and they are in command with NSC, our NSC, and with the United States NSC. So that allows for more bilateral operations, joint training, joint research, development, and production of new armaments. These are things that we need to further. And these various discussions can lead to the possibility to have a slimmer structure because we will have joint operations. And then as far as resources are concerned, this is a very difficult issue. We have 5.2 trillion yen in debt. What are we going to do about Social Security? What are we going to do about caring for our elder population? So we need to look at what it is that we can do, what we need to do to decide on something, and where we need to concentrate our efforts. Further, we have a declining population. We have fewer young people. So we're looking more at AI and robotics and shifting our economy to be able to develop those fields. And then as far as China is concerned, China has set up a drone squadron so that it can attack a U.S. military ship. Drones are not effective armaments, but they are something that are involved in the third offset. And further, with facial recognition software and increased accuracy, or with more drones. What is it that we can do to respond technologically to these new Chinese technologies and effectiveness? One other thing is operations. As far as the where we become involved in operations, as Mr. Morimoto talked about, we need to work on addressing the global wealth gap and what is it Japan can do in that regard. My feeling is that the Middle East and Africa and Europe, we should leave that up to the United States, and we should concentrate on Southeast Asia. We should concentrate our operations on Southeast Asia and work with the United States and Australia to have maritime patrols. That sort of concentration on one region would allow us to concentrate and be more effective.
I think that's right. We need a mass, which another way is we need volume, which means we need low cost. And you pointed to some technological solutions. And to Sheila's question about capacity, jointness equals capacity. 2 + 2 = 7 when it comes to military operations if you are truly joint and interoperable. So that is my opportunity now to ask Sheila a question, which may provoke our guests.
Okay.
So this is ambitious,
Right.
but it's also fairly clear,
Right.
the agenda. This TICO, this National Defense Program guideline that's coming up, there hasn't been a kondankai, there hasn't been a
Right.
commission to describe the strategy. And my hunch is that's because there's already a consensus.
Right.
And my question for you is there? What if Prime Minister Abe doesn't run for third term? What if there is political uncertainty? How much political support is there for this agenda that these experienced former defense and national security officials agree on?
Great. I like it that I'm the non-politician who gets to answer
Yeah,
the political
and then
question
provoke.
and provoke you. I love it. So it's interesting to me, and I've just finished looking at the way in which there's a growing consensus about the value of military power and military force. And it's interesting to me because you still have all the static in the diet, but there's not a basic contention anymore about whether PKO participation is good for Japan, or whether cooperation with Australia, Philippines, Vietnam, India is good for Japan. You rarely have that kind of political debate anymore in Japan, which I think is evidence one of a consensus that Japan needs to be able to respond to what's happening in the region, but also that Japan needs to be able to shape what is happening in the region. So I think that's a very important indicator beyond the public opinion polling and things like that. Now, when you get into the issues that Nakatani Sensei raised on the LDP's proposition, right? Things like, the attacking foreign bases with missiles, right? Preemption, right? Or conventional strike capability, absolutely. I suspect there will be some bifurcation of opinion about whether that's a good idea or whether that's really okay for Japan to get that kind of capability. But that's at the margins. We're still talking about choices, not overall approach to thinking about it. One of the things that I think is interesting this time about the TICO is exactly what you pointed out, which is there is no kondankai. There is no need to get the head of Asahi Beer or wherever it was to preside over a conversation, right, on national defense. I think the Japanese public is quite ready to have the Japanese government say, what are you going to do about this situation? So that's one piece. But the other is there's also an interagency process going on here that wasn't true in the past. You now have the National Security Secretariat. You have a conversation among bureaucracies in the establishment and development of the TICO that wasn't there before. And granted, a lot of the legwork is done in MOD, but it's also being vetted across the board in the Prime Minister's office in a way that I think the MOD didn't really have to defend itself, it doesn't have to defend itself in the same way bureaucratically as in the past. So I think the past kondankais were to reach out to the public, but they were also part of the bureaucratic internal government dynamic. And I'd love to hear our leaders talk about that. Mr. Abe, I cannot imagine in today's LDP that there is much difference over the recommendations that the committee inside the party put forward. Again, it may be, as Aki pointed out, it may be the difference between how much budget goes to defense versus social security versus other, education, other priorities. But I'm not so sure that there's a huge cleavage inside the LDP. The question is whether there's a lot of cleavage outside of the LDP. And frankly, the opposition parties today are so fractured that I can't imagine that this becomes a huge debate that would end up in a new election or something like that. So I think you have a public consensus. I think the process has changed somewhat inside the government. And I think the LDP actually represents a fair representation of what the Japanese people are looking for.
Aki, you're not technically in an opposition party right now.
In between, yeah. ちょっとですね、今やっ
As far as the opposition parties are concerned, I and Mr. Gemba, what we can say is that the opposition parties really haven't had substantial dialogues they just say that they're against revision of the 9th article of the Constitution. They're against warfare. So they're really marginalizing themselves in the kind of dialogue that they're engaged in. And so they don't want to operate outside of that closed sphere. So basically, as far as we're concerned, we feel that we should be able to look at discussions about what to do about acquisitions, how to divide responsibilities with the United States, and whether we should be able to attack enemy forces. Up until now, we've had the United States being the spear and Japan being the shield. But we need to change that situation. And where is it that we can play a larger role? And as far as overall U.S. Japan alliance, how much can Japan bear responsibility for? I think there's plenty of room for discussion on these issues. So how much would be enough for Japan to do? That kind of discussion is necessary. We've been working on this, and we have tried to have constructive exchange of dialogue with the Liberal Democratic Party, and we'd like to look at what it is we can do to come up with an alternative. And we have a bipartisan crowd here today, and I would love to hear your opinions on this. I don't think that the two of you actually are in the opposition party. As far as security is concerned, both the ruling party and the opposition party have to bear responsibility. And so the opposing party just has basically said they're against everything. And this is not sufficient. As far as defense is concerned, the internet connects the world, and so as far as the regions are concerned, you can't be concerned with just one, and you can't make a clear distinction between air forces, land forces, and marine forces. In the United States, information is sent to a military ship, and a missile can be shot off as a result of that. So also for ballistic missile defense, this should not just be defense only. We should be able to use our combat planes and our missiles and other armaments so that all of them know what the situation is, and that instantaneous decision-making can be made on that basis. So there needs to be more of a collection of and availability of information about our overall forces. And then as far as controlling information, technology in this regard is being developed, and that allows us to make a clear distinction in command structure between the United States and Japan. So when we look at cross-domain dogma, as what is it we can do with innovation in our armaments? This is something that we can look at, and I think that we need to build a more effective force in Japan.
ご指名があったから一言だけ。
Well, since you pointed out my name, I'd like to talk about this. So regarding preemptive attacks, this should be discussed at the National Diet. And then so we've been talking about this attacking the enemy bases or preemptive attack. I understand the definition of the discussion. If we would have this preemptive attack function, then how much would it cost for us? Because we would have to have a full platform to equip ourselves, and I think it would cost us a few trillion Japanese yen, and then this is like many numbers of, for example, aircraft squadrons, and if we are to spend a few trillion Japanese yens, and then we may have to use this money a little bit more wisely based on the third offset strategy, because we may be able to equip ourselves to battle better in space or cyber domains rather than having a preemptive platform. For this discussion, I cannot really agree with the idea of having a preemptive attack capability so easily. And However, we need to think about missile defense capability of Japan. We always have to ask, is it enough for us to protect the people of Japan only with the current the missile defense capability? By having the preemptive attack capability, we will have its own deterrence against other countries. And then also, by having this preemptive attack capability, then we can be equal to other countries' forces as well. And I think that this may be a way for us to catch up with the other forces.
Is to recreate the diet debate in Washington. And I have to say, it's a more intelligent debate than the Congress. Let me open it to the audience. We have a lot of experts.
That's why I'm here.
Yeah, go ahead. Short question, please.
Thank you for coming. My name is Mitsuo Nakai, Reagan Foundation. Sheila, you mentioned yesterday that in terms of national defense budget was so vast difference between today and yesterday. Can you break that one down a little bit? Because I've been away from Japan for a long time. I'm a Japan native U.S. citizen, so it's the limited information is coming into me from Japan. So, but looking at Japan from outside, I'm not feeling so great because Japan military used to be here, China down here. It's completely turned around today. I'm not feeling so great about that because I believe in peace through strength. Without that, we can't lead Asia Pacific anymore. So can you break that one down for me? Thank you.
And there are other people actually on the panel who are much more well-equipped to deal with that than me. So I'll turn that part of that answer maybe over to Morimoto Sensei or others who might want to pick it up. But the point I was making yesterday is that many people don't understand that Japan has had one of the largest defense budgets globally, right? It's been in the top 10 now for some time. The 1990s is when you started to see the shift in numbers, right? Today, again, if you take at face value the Chinese numbers, and we probably shouldn't take them at face value, but let's just take them at face value. China spends 8 to 9 times as much as the Japanese on military, and its military. So there's an acceleration of military investment by the Chinese that is feeding into that larger strategic investment environment rather that we're talking about. So there is a base question here. That's what I was trying to ask this morning to our experts is, how do you compensate for that level of difference of investment in military capability? But I think you're right. This is not a good moment for Japan. It's the other powers around it are accelerating their military investments, and then there is a serious question, and the Japanese experts here have been debating that actually for some time now. Morimoto-san, do you want to comment on the defense budget specifically, or?
Regarding this defense budget, we do have the midterm defense force build-up program that would expire next year, and then we have the increase of about 8% in average. In the last fiscal year, that's included in this midterm defense force build-up program, and then so we will have about 1.3%, so we can achieve the overall increase of 8%. And so defense is not only about the question of money. However, we always have to ask us what kind of capability and also what kind of field that we should improve ourselves or build up in. And so it depends on what kind of research we should do to discuss this budget issues. So regarding NATO, they have about 2% contribution increase by each country. And also, we do not have a similar rule regarding collective defense issues, how many percentage each country should make contribution of in terms of defense. So this is about GDP 2%. This is not a clearly written rule, but this is sort of like a common understanding. this may look a little bit lower than ideal. However, the Japanese defense is actually taken, 40% is taken for food and also salary and other daily goods. And this type of purchase or acquisition is not done at once. However, we have to do we have to have a long-term planning of acquisition. For example, purchasing one E2D within this year, but the purchasing process itself is not a single year budget system. We have to see multi-year budget system so that we can plan ourselves better. And so that's why within this midterm defense force build-up program, we do have a larger budget allocated toward the end of each midterm programs. And then we talked about the population decrease in Japan. And we have about 46,000 in maritime. From 20 years from now, probably we'll be looking at 25,000 or 35,000, meaning that the decrease of the number of maritime members. But we have to be able to maintain the current defense capability or defense lines. So we would have to have unmanned patrol aircraft or devices. And we should have complementary capabilities from AIs or unmanned technologies so that we can supplement the reduction of the population of Japan. And it is going to be difficult to achieve the mission of the defense goals of Japan without thinking about unmanned technology and also how we can maximize what we have currently. When we look at President Trump's statement regarding that each NATO membership should contribute GDP 2% to the forces, and I think that this is very reasonable because updating military equipment is costly. And then this is not only purchasing new equipment, but at the same time, we should be looking at more costly parts which will be spent on maintenance and then also repairs. And Aegis Ashore is a very costly equipment. And for us to be able to have our defense capability and then also deployed 100%, then GDP 2% is a very reasonable number.
Right.
The U.S. fleet was smaller than the Japanese fleet in 1941 in the Pacific. The Germans had fewer tanks and aircraft than the British and the French in 1940. There are many examples where what really mattered in the end was innovation. And the question is whether our democracies and our legislators can allow innovation in operations and technology. We're certainly capable of it. Our politics sometimes get in the way. We have time for more questions. This is a very technical discussion, and we do this out of respect for the audience, which is very, very good. Mayor-san. And then, sorry, is it on this, Admiral? On this? Okay, Mayor-san. We don't call him Mayor-san, but Mayor-san. Kevin?
Just a quick question. There's discussion about you've got so much you have to respond to North Korea, China, and the budget needs to go up. Everybody gets that, and the budget's very restrictive. But there's been discussion also, kind of a sense I have of a resentment in Japan among some about the amount of foreign military sales, the amount of procurement from the U.S. and others, but mostly from the U.S. But how do you match this tension? There's a tension between trying to subsidize your domestic industry or try to build your industry and trying to most economically efficiently use your defense budget. And I think you're going to see, I mean, it's a long-standing issue. We have the same issue in the United States. But I think you're going to see some questions that have to be some decisions have to be made within the next year or two about things like very expensive programs like replacing the F-2 fighter. That's 12 or 13 years down the road, but you have to make these decisions now. So I would just like to hear your views of where is this debate going to go? You've got real threats and these kind of academic discussions about, oh, too much FMS. I hope that doesn't overcome the realistic approach of how can you most efficiently get the capabilities that you need to respond to the threats. How do you see that going?
Let me get Admiral, the Admiral's question, and then we'll answer and finish.
Yeah, just one question to Mr. Nakatani. Yes, having the, say, much larger capability in terms of the attacking the enemy land are important, but at the same time, current status of the self-defense force, or capability of the self-defense force, I would say current capability would be something around 70 to 80% of what it should be. So, but reading the recommendation proposal of the LDP, leaving that still unestablished 30 or 20% gap, leaving that area, and LDP is making a recommendation to reinforce more striking force matter areas. But what if Japan still take the U.S. Japan alliance posture into account? What JSDF should do first is to fill the gap, 30 or 20% lacking today. Then the more resource allocation should be done to the new area. So without that, I think the function of the U.S. Japan alliance would be weakened in the future because leaving our the handicap as it is today. That is not a healthy thing. Of course, I understand that your point, the LDP's point, but like the Sila's questions, how well should we reallocate or allocate our given resources? That is another thing that I want the LDP to take into account. That's my question.
We probably have 1 minute each. Regarding the roles and the responsibility divided by Japan and the United States, I think that's a discussion that we need to have in the future. And of course that we are talking about a very costly matter, and our discussion should be very detail-oriented. Regarding missile defense, we are talking about interception, but this might not be sufficient. Also, missiles can be launched to anywhere in the territory of Japan, and so we should have flexibility to intercept such launches. And regarding preemptive attack capabilities, that can lead to larger deterrence, or meaning active defense. Those things can be considered in the future. And we can deny other countries' invasion or attack to Japan by us having its own deterrence. And I think that a self-defense force can carry out some of the scope. Of course, that we'd like to consider discussion with the United States. And also regarding defense budget, this is becoming more and more costly. So F-35 is actually made, final assembly is done in Japan, and this doesn't provide too many jobs in Japan. So small and middle scale companies are not really taking advantage of this F-35 programs. And so we should not be dependent on FMS too much, because we need to think about job creation in the Japanese defense industry as well. And so that's my sentiment to the Japanese defense industry.
物は当然アメリカから購入しなきゃいけませんが、 科学にしても
Of course, as far as advanced armaments is concerned, we need to continue to buy from the United States. But it must also be the case that we are able to create and arm ourselves with some domestic products. And so we need to also be able to purchase military systems at a reasonable price.
Side. Morimoto Sensei?
Yes.
What I'll have to say probably is related here. Why is it that we have such a large percentage of foreign military sales? The reason for that is that our defense and our security are looking for high cost performance armaments, and it's actually more economical to purchase high performance weapons that have already been developed and produced. That's cheaper than building them domestically. That's why we buy so much from the United States. And then as far as producing these in Japan, if we were to do this, we would have to look at sales outside of Japan for as far as development and research and production. It's very costly to engage in those, and so in order for us to be able to finance that, we would have to look at selling armaments to other countries. And our Ministry of Finance prefers, in fact, foreign military sales, purchasing from the United States, even though it's more costly than producing it in Japan. And as far as priorities are concerned, I think cost performance is something we need to place priority on. What can we do about decreasing the costs and having high performance weapons? That's Ministry of Finance's most pressing concern. The second is, as Mr. Nagatani said, to what degree can our domestic industry become involved in producing these? The third is, what sorts of threats do we face and will we face in the future? What sort of threat should we anticipate? And given that, how can we have the most operationally complete armament to deal with it? These three things form the basis for our purchase and development of weapons systems. But these criteria contain a contradiction, which is where should the emphasis be placed, and various ministries have different thoughts on that, and so we need to really look a very detailed way at all of these factors. And then as far as what sort of offers we could receive from American and British companies, we will be receiving proposals soon, and then the new guideline to come out in October. This will discuss what we'll do with the successor to the F2. This requires a political decision, not something that we can decide on at our level. As everyone has said, we have clear and present danger facing us, but we cannot continue on with the same acquisition structure we've had up until now. And it's not that we in the opposition parties haven't done anything. We are looking at Ministry of Economics, Trade, and Infrastructure, and at the Land and Infrastructure Ministry. We are, of course, asking the Ministry of Defense to work on developing armaments to protect us, but if we were to all come, we haven't really had an all-of-government approach whereby everyone comes to the table and looks at these contradicting interests. We need to have a mechanism by which those of us who are involved can look at what to do about helicopters, what to do about rifles, how do we deal with that over the next 10 years, how do we buy parts from small and medium-sized enterprises. And if we could all come together and make decisions on this, this would help us to be able to come to a decision about what is the highest performance and what is the cheapest armament and where should we buy it from. Up until now, we have purchased mostly from abroad, but I think that we need to work on critical technology, developing it domestically and also applying it domestically. So we need to keep those two things in mind. And if we don't do that, we won't be able to deal with future threats, and we also won't be able to deal with our fiscal issues and our population decline.
Things I thought may be useful to raise before we quit. One is that I think a lot of listening a little carefully to the kinds of comments that are being made and the discussions that are emerging now in the debate in Japan. We didn't discuss it here because it's not directly associated with defense planning. But I think a lot of us are alert to the fact that there's a growing conversation in Japan about this quickly changing geostrategic environment and about the U.S. Japan alliance. So you have a former ambassador to the United States who wrote in Sankei, right, that the time has come for a discussion in Japan about potentially having nuclear weapons, right? You have study groups in Japan with former policymakers who also make the same suggestion that it is a serious moment now to consider Japan's long-term strategic positioning. And Ishiba Shigeru-san, who is, as you know, has been saying this for a very long time, is continuing to say that we ought to take another look at the U.S.-Japan Security Treaty. So we think about these long-term defense planning decisions, and especially Japan now is at this turning point with the next Taiko. But I think at some point we want to have a pretty serious conversation about what kinds of transformations in our partnership we might want to be looking at more carefully in the coming years. As I think that we are going to have accelerated change in the region. Whether peace breaks out on the Korean Peninsula or not, I think it means the U.S.-Japan alliance is going to be under more pressure than it's been in the past. And I think all of us in this room want it to be successful in navigating these various changes, for good or for bad. But I do think the time has come for a pretty serious strategic look at the way the alliance works, and thinking about openly what it is that needs to change to make sure we're adaptable and flexible and our militaries are able to contend with the increasing pressures that are on them in Asia today.
So to conclude, the good news is in the forums, we no longer debate whether or not it's okay to use the word Dome alliance or whether or not civilian control is threatened by what we're doing. We're past that. That's the good news. The bad news is we need a lot of capacity and a lot of capability, and we're going to have to be very, very smart, very joint, very innovative, and do the kind of things Sheila pointed to at the end. So we've done a little bit of that today with your help. Thank you very much. Please join me in thanking our terrific panelists.
Oh, thanks a lot.